Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie, and I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Race and Difference Colloquium. There have been a lot of wonderful events that have happened at Emory in the past week, including our symposium on slavery in the university. One of the other big announcements this past week was our Board of Trustees officially issuing a land acknowledgement to the Muskogee Creek Nation, and it's my pleasure to read it today, and I'm going to personalize it for JWJI. Emory University and the James Weldon Johnson Institute acknowledge the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory and JWJI seek to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of the land. As some of you may know, JWJI is also engaged in other programming efforts with Emory College, and one of our partnerships is with the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative. Some of you may have heard about the Each Other exhibit that's now at the Carlos Museum. As part of their series with that exhibit tomorrow night at 7, there's going to be a pre-screening conversations with the creators of Sweetland, which is an Indigenous opera. So there's more information on our newsletter, or I guess our e-blast if you see that, and then you can also go to the Carlos Museum page as well. So today we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Margaret Chin to talk about her new book. Dr. Chin is professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She was born and raised in New York City and is the child of Chinese immigrant parents. She received her BA from Harvard and her PhD from Columbia University. Her publications include the award-winning books Stuck, Why Asian Americans Don't Reach the Top of the Corporate Ladder, and she's going to be speaking about that today. This book is an analysis of the need to understand how factors such as race and trust can hold second-generation Asian Americans back. She's also the author of Sewing Women, Immigrants, and the New York City Garment Industry, which is an ethnography of the Chinese, Korean, Mexican, and Ecuadorian garment worker experience. She's a faculty associate of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, the Asian American Studies Center, and the AANAPISI program at Hunter College. She's also a member of the Asian and Asian American Research Institute. Her other honors include an award from the American Sociological Association, the Minority Fellows Award, an NSF dissertation grant, a Social Science Research Council postdoctoral fellowship in international migration, and a Woodrow Wilson Foundation Institute for Citizens and Scholars Career Enhancement Fellowship. She was the vice president of the Eastern Sociological Society, from 2015 to 2016. And her other research specialties include immigration, family, work, Asian Americans, and children of immigrants. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Margaret Chin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie and Rhonda Patrick and Antoinette Burrell for doing all the background work, for having me and for inviting me today. I'm really very happy to come speak to the James Weldon Johnson Institute. I'm glad to share my work, and I'm glad to have people listen, and I'm always glad to have people ask questions about my work. So let me go ahead and share my screen. You can let me know if that works. Oh, and thank you very much for the very warm welcome. Let me, before I actually start the actual talk, I just want to say that this research came about mostly because because I'm a Harvard interviewer, I happened to be at a reception one day for a new Harvard college admits. And I was talking to an admissions officer there, and he was saying, you know what? There's so many Asian American students that go to Harvard now, over 25% of the class, and you went a long time ago, and you went at a time when there were only 5% Asian Americans in your incoming class. It's been a while. What happened to all of those people in between? How are they doing? And how are they doing in the corporate world? And that question kind of stuck with me. And I was interested in trying to figure out what really did happen to them. And that's the genesis of this book, Why Asian Americans Don't Reach the Top of the Corporate Ladder. I could have written one on how they reached there, but the reality is that they don't actually reach there. So let me go ahead and start this. Okay, so today I'm going to discuss the research in my book and also focus on describing two narratives that represent the cultural schemas that depict Asian Americans, both of which are untrue. The first one is the model minority mythology that's used to divide and conquer us, is what I most often hear and most often see, especially among people of color. And the second schema that's also untrue is this forever foreign cultural schema used quite often to scapegoat Asian Americans, to blame us for usually economic hardship, and most recently for the pandemic that we're experiencing right now. While I myself have studied the working class the most, studying the elite drew my interest because I noticed there's actually very little written to address what happens to Asian Americans who are at the top, for people who seem to be successful, which a lot of us assume that we are, but people don't really understand the processes of how they got there or didn't get there. So my approach was to basically situate the story of Asian Americans getting stuck near the top of the corporate ladder, actually hitting the bamboo ceiling. That's the term you'll hear most often in the world out there. When they talk about the bamboo ceiling, they're often talking about Asian Americans not moving to the top, as a problem within the literature of immigrants and their children. And that literature, immigrants and their children, do not fully address this at all. So I complicate that process by acknowledging that race actually matters. And it matters more the higher one goes up to the corporate ladder. This is why I believe that most of the studies of Asian Americans are about them only in school and very little in the work world. Asian Americans, like that of the immigrant story, mostly written about whites, actually tell how well they actually do. But once you introduce race into story, as I said, it complicates everything a little bit more. So if you look at the slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about who the Asian Americans are and how they fit into the US. So Asian American success. It was assumed that children of immigrants, all immigrants, in fact, would have a rosy future in the United States, as predicted by studies of them as children. In fact, most studies of Asian American children, and especially the second generation, paint a fairly pain-free ascent through school and into the work world, at least getting jobs. Why wouldn't you believe that? The statistics that are usually put in the media are that of Asian Americans as a whole, who are currently 7% of the population, but the children are over 25% of many Ivy League entering classes. However, little is known that their makeup is over 20 different ethnic groups, and they speak over 20 different ethnic languages. So therefore, even within the Asian American category of itself, Asian Americans are a very complex group. Starting with bachelor's degrees, since most studies have written about them in education, Asian Americans actually have the highest number of bachelor degrees. Asian Americans have 54% as a group. 54% of them or more actually have college degrees versus whites, which have 37%, and African Americans, 27%, and Hispanic, 18%. So if you look at the bachelor's degrees as a whole, it looks like Asian Americans are doing very well, especially in educational attainment. However, But like the income distribution, that's another statistic that's often touted about them. Asian American ethnic groups have the highest income levels. They have an income level of close to $86,000 a year versus $62,000 for the US population. I'll show you a little bit here how diverse Asian Americans are. Among the Asian American ethnic groups, they also have some of the highest and lowest average or median household income levels. Among Indian Americans, or Indian as Indians from the Indian subcontinent, if you look at this particular chart, you can actually see that Indians have an average household income in 2019 of $119,000. That's one of the highest in the US. But among Asian Americans, we have Burmese, which only make $44,000 a year. And among people in poverty, you'll see that Asian Americans also range the gamut. The two with the lowest median income levels, the Burmese and the Nepalese, are some of the lowest. In fact, Asian Americans are a bifurcated bimodal group because you'll have some who earn so much it raises the median for the whole group. So what I'm trying to say is that for Asian Americans, even though they have the highest level of average household income, because they are a bimodal group, the top part, they make so much that they raise the median income for the whole group. But what it hides is those at the very bottom. What you don't see are those people in poverty. And what you also don't know is that in New York City, Asian Americans are actually the group with the highest poverty rate out of all racial groups. And little is that known. And because of that fact, people don't think that we should actually study inequality among Asian Americans, because that average income just hides the fact. Little do people know that actually Chinese Americans, the Chinese ethnic group, actually fall in both categories. They have some of the people with the highest income level, as well as people with people in poverty. So these statistics you can actually look up in the Pew Research Center. And this study, this chart comes from an April 2021 study. So you can take a look at that. So the image overall, if you look at the level of educational attainment and the level of income attainment, is that of the model minority, the exceptional minority. And the model minority stereotype paints a broad stroke of Asian Americans that glosses over its blemishes. The image became especially popular in 1966 during the Civil Rights era after the publication of a New York Times story by sociologist William Peterson. He wrote that Japanese Americans, the success story, depicts Asian Americans pulling themselves up by their own bootstrap, comparing them actually to African Americans who were actually on the streets marching right before or during the 1960s. However, many don't realize too that this image originated even before 1966. Historian Ellen Wu found that it was popular during the period right after World War II, when Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American born, and who were, of course, citizens, were interned during World War II. After their property was taken away during World War II, they were seen as enemies, like the Japanese the US was fighting overseas. In the aftermath, after release from the internment camps, they were actually asked to disperse across the US into communities with very few Asian Americans. And by playing the model minority, they, the Japanese Americans, were hoping that the mostly white communities would accept them as the good minorities. Asian immigrants, for the most part, could not naturalize and become citizens of the US until 1952. That meant they could not vote. And with the civil rights movement, there was an outcry to liberalize immigration and to remove quotas from the 1924 and to get rid of the 1924 Immigration Act. The 1965 immigration law did that when it was finally passed, and immigrants now are still coming in under rules from that 1965 law. And they come in under two priority preferences, one for the family and another for professional degrees. The much more educated Asians that come in under this new law, they come in holding professional degrees and holding bachelor degrees for the most part. And they immigrated as what we would call as hyper-selected. The level and the percentage of Asian immigrants coming into the US with these degrees are actually higher than the level of people with bachelor's and educational degrees back in their home country. And that's a term called hyper-selected that Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou talk about in their writings. So when they come into the US, they actually bring with them resources and an understanding of what education can buy them and can help them with upward mobility. And of course, that's translated to their children. So even as some of these parents couldn't get certification or licenses to be nurses or doctors, or even be employed in the jobs they had in their homelands, they were able to use their knowledge and resources to help their children get a better degree. And part of that, what I talk about is they're able to translate those concepts and create a new schema for Asian Americans, for their Asian American born children, which I'll speak about in a little bit, called the Asian American Playbook. So it's not an Asian playbook, but it's specifically for the context here in the US. So the model minority mythology is just one of the reasons that clouds research questions in all of the fields about Asian Americans. So instead of figuring out and dispelling the model minority myth and to expand our discussions of race, so to include Asian Americans with Black, white, and Latinos in more complex ways, the media, I would say, and some researchers use the concept of the model minority specifically to divide and to wedge Asian Americans between the different minority groups, and oftentimes even between Blacks and whites too, to sometimes create an image that make Asian Americans seem more adjacent to whites. So obviously there are reasons to study Asian Americans, especially in the work world. So there are very few studies of the children of Asian American immigrants as adults, and especially of them moving into the work world. Now that sounds a little bit strange, right? But it has to do with the concepts of where people have placed Asian immigrants and their children. And moreover, it also seems strange because if you think about it, most people spend their lives at work and have their identity shaped by work. So why haven't more researchers looked at Asian Americans in the work world? So there are a couple things going on. So in the literature of Asian Americans in the professional work world, that literature is actually missing from the research. Most studies about Asian Americans and work are about immigrants and work, and about immigrants, working class immigrants specifically, as in my previous research on garment workers. There is also, on the other hand, research on glass ceilings about women and about race in the professional work world, specifically about African Americans and Latino Americans, but not much on Asian Americans specifically. And why is that? Because most research on children of immigrants, like Asian Americans, have focused on education. Focus on education because most of these researchers have seen Asian Americans following the immigrant path like that of white immigrants, basically succeeding and eventually moving on and succeeding just like the other white immigrants have. But that's not really true. So let me go here and look at the second generation. So, however, as a race and immigration scholar, I understand that many researchers were reluctant to study this topic because the Asian American children or the second generation seem so young in age. At least that's what's been reported in the census. And because of the stereotype promise is actually the self-fulfilling prophecy that if you call Asian Americans the model minority, teachers and others who can, teachers and others will just make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're assuming that Asian Americans automatically will do well. Anyway, so they seem to follow this process. And what most researchers have said, like Richard Alba, is that these Asian American children of immigrants would be able to move up just as the baby boomer whites would retire. And we really shouldn't have to worry about them because they're all just still young. Only 40% of Asian Americans are US born, and their average age is only 19 of the American born. Thus, they're still young, and they actually haven't moved up. On the other hand, in other studies, even done 20 years ago by Phil Kasnitz and Mary Waters and John Mollenkoff and Jennifer Holdaway, they actually looked at their census data and saw that they can actually group children of immigrants differently. And what they did was they grouped the 1.5 generation, those who came to the US before the age of 13, along with the American born. And that group, the broadly defined second generation, who are all obviously steeped in American culture and speak English without an accent, seem to be doing fine in school, at least 20 years ago. So if that was done 20 years ago, that means that there is a whole group of middle-aged Asian Americans who are in the work world right now of the broadly defined second generation. And that, of course, is the group that I'm talking about. And the other way of looking at this is that if you look at the 1965 immigration law, it's been over 50 years. And if it's over 50 years since Asian American or Asian immigrants have come here, that means that their children are certainly in their 40s and 50s. And we should be able now to take a look at how some of them are doing, especially in those jobs, and how and if they're moving into any of the C-suite jobs. That is, jobs with the title of chief in the title or of similarly status. So where are they now and what's going on with them? So let me put this story into context of the professional work world. So here's where I step in and I decide, well, I'm going to take a look at that broadly defined second generation and see what's going on. So let me put them in the context of what I saw in the professional world. So how are Asian Americans doing in comparison to Blacks and Latin and Hispanics? So among the Fortune 500 CEOs in 2017, there are less than a dozen who are Asian American. 3 are Black, 24 are women. And this was written in an article called America's C-Suites Keep Getting Whiter and More Male Too. And this was in Bloomberg Business Week. And even in Silicon Valley, where you would expect plenty of Asian Americans there, Buck G and Denise Peck's article in a 2018 Harvard Business Review article found that in 5 firms, LinkedIn, Yahoo, HP, Google, and Intel, while there are Asian Americans, 27% of them make up the professionals, there are only 14% of them who are executives. And there are even harsher statistics in law firms. Judge Goodwin Liu and his team found that Asian Americans were the largest minority group. However, they had the highest attrition rates and the lowest ratio to partnership. In one recent year, while there were 124 Asian American associates, only 14 became partners as compared to 422 white associates, 127 white partners, 127 became partners. Out of 33 Hispanic associates, only 5 became partners. And for African Americans, there were 24 and only 1 became a partner. So in that year, that 1 year of 2017, only 3% of all partners of all law firms, only 3% of all partners of these large law firms were people of color. And here's a new statistic I found in a Fortune article from June 2020. They cited that 98.7% of $69 trillion managed by asset management companies were controlled by white men. That meant that 1.3% are controlled by African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx, natives, and women. So in asset management, only in the less senior roles do white professionals drop to less than 80%. So when you look at overall in the professional corporate work world, the pie of opportunity is so much smaller for women and people of color, or inequality is so much larger than we thought. Part of the reason why we don't know a lot of this is it's actually really hard to do research in these corporations. They're mostly privately held firms. And sometimes it's really difficult to get people to talk about what goes on. We know about what happens in school because they're public, but what happens in the world when people are making and earning income and building wealth or hoping to build wealth, this is where it matters, where you're actually working. So in my book, Stuck, I went about trying to design a qualitative research study conducting in-depth interviews of over 100 respondents. And I went to professional events. I sat in sometimes on listening to professional coaches explain to me how they coached people of color and Asian Americans. I ended up interviewing East, South, and Southeast Asians. And those, when I talk about South Asians, the census breaks out the Indian subcontinent. So you'll see me breaking those out as well. And I follow those patterns when I report them. My respondents are all American born, the second generation, or they're all American raised, the 1.5 generation who immigrated before the age of 13, like that of the earlier study that I talked about by Kasnitz, Molenkiff, Waters, and Holdaway. And I call this group the broadly defined second generation. And I have equally matched women and men, as you see from the slide, and interviews all across all Asian American ethnicities. And most of them are in Chinese and Korean, and fewer South Asians. Most of them were all elite college graduates. I chose to interview in 3 broadly defined fields. They're all non-STEM, because I feel that STEM has, Asian Americans have a stereotype of doing well in STEM. So I decided I'll choose something else to see what happens, because this is the broadly defined. They don't have a problem with writing and with speaking English. So I looked at these knowledge industries, law, finance, and media. So for example, I interview people from Davis Polk, Goldman Sachs, MTV, and positions such as Chief Operating Officer, Managing Director, Partner, or Senior Vice President. I interviewed 3 decades of college graduates from the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s to examine specific historical differences and policies available to them, and thus access to programs and jobs and movement up the career ladder. So for example, graduates of the 1980s had access to affirmative action programs, which many of my interviewees participated in. Asian Americans made up only 1.5% of the population in 1980 and only 2% in 1985. Fewer from the younger cohorts had access to these programs as the Asian American population grew and politics in general reframed affirmative action programs to be give-outs to unworthy recipients. Thus, during the 1990s, it meant that fewer programs were available for Asian Americans, and some Asian Americans didn't want to be included. However, by the 2000s, the youngest cohort should have had access to more, at least Asian American sponsors and mentors and people to network with and to get advice from. But they said there weren't enough of them, actually. And there weren't actually enough of them in these high places in their corporations. That's what they actually noticed. For those in the oldest cohort, those more than 30 years out of college, a majority of them couldn't help but wonder why things have moved so slow for the cohorts following them, given how quickly they moved up. And now there are even more Asian Americans in elite colleges. There should be plenty of Asian Americans up there, but that isn't the case, as I've shown you with these numbers. So here's a quick slide that showed the different groups. And one of the reasons why I couldn't get Many Asian Indians and South Asians to talk to me were that there are very few of them who fit this broadly defined second generation group. So these immigration patterns, they affect who's actually out there for people to interview and who's actually part of the broadly defined second generation. So let me just give you this is a quick outline of my book, but I'm only going to focus on a few of these topics. I'm going to go over the Asian American Playbook quickly, the double bind quickly, and talk mostly about trust. Okay, so let me go ahead quickly and talk about the Asian American Playbook. And it's a concept, like I said, I define. I coined the term Asian American Playbook. And as you can see from this quote, Vince typifies what he wanted to do and what his parents encouraged him to do. Obviously, this is not something that you would do in an Asian home country. So it's something specific, structural, that's passed down over time. It's an oral instruction book. So it's a term to label an almost universally used guide composed of verbal advice that Asian Americans use as they move through school and into the professional world. Ultimately, this Asian American Playbook is a significant part of the overall framework, contributing to the difficult time that Asian Americans have in moving up the corporate ladder. All of my interviewees, no matter what or which ethnic background, from East Asian to Southeast Asian heritage, or even class differences or even gender, mention the general playbook narrative, and of course, how closely they followed it or not, and what they found helpful or not. It's a verbally transmitted, informal and practical how-to guide for Asian Americans designed to show them how to make it and be successful at both school and work. These tips are passed on to help young Asian Americans attain the ideal of the Asian American dream, or you could just say the American dream, where Asian Americans are part of the multi-ethnic society. All of my interviewees mentioned this playbook narrative or script, which helped some to a point, and usually that was only to entry-level work. This playbook says Asian Americans work hard, have access to opportunities, and are able to be in control of their situation, choose what they want to do with their lives, and find rewards for themselves and their families. Basically, do well in school, get a good job, become a doctor, engineer, banker, lawyer, or be a loser. And this was a quote from one of my interviewees. This they do all by themselves, not relying on others. The script dovetails with the model minority myth and achievement-minded story that mainstream American public accepts. Asian American parents raising children in the US could have language difficulties, little time to parent because they work long hours, and even those who are engineers, scientists, professionals may lack a network and information for how their kids should proceed. The playbook narrative is important for Asian American parents because it gives them a script to follow in the USA, and it's been proven to work, at least in getting a good education, getting a job, and maybe moving up midway in the career ladder. My interviewee said that the advice was not at all detailed enough or nuanced enough to help them get higher in the career world. The goal for the Asian American parents is, at least for the generation born and raised in America, is to be successful because their parents sacrificed so much. The Immigrant Bargain, as it is known, written and researched by Vivian Louie and Rob Smith, both of CUNY, they've written plenty of this, that many immigrant parents, no matter what racial background, believe that they've given up a lot and have basically taught their children to understand that they've given up everything for their kids, and their kids should feel devoted in returning what they can. And that is that immigrant bargain that many children believe. So as one of my interviewees put it, every time I was in a Korean setting, I was told to just defer to authority, to my elders, shut up, work hard, and don't ask questions. Don't be confrontational. And if you do that, good things will happen. That worked for me up to a certain point. I kept my head down, focusing on grades and testing. I went to MIT, got a good GPA, and then got a job at finance. I was an analyst. I branded myself as someone who was extremely hardworking, trustworthy, really good with numbers. I could build models in my sleep. If anyone wanted something done, they could give it to Eric. That's who I talked to. And I got promoted to be associate. Same thing. Partners would fight over me because they knew I could get shit done. And then at vice president, my first performance review wasn't great because they said I didn't speak up enough and wasn't commercial enough. Now, that was deeply upsetting to him, as though he was actually following that Asian American playbook to the letter. And he wasn't quite sure how to move forward from there. And when he spoke to anybody else who was Asian American, they repeated that playbook again to him. So obviously there's something quite missing, or there's something going on with racial discrimination that the playbook doesn't acknowledge. So this playbook doesn't include sketching out the structures of a corporation, address personal leadership skills, stretch assignments, networks, being authentic, and not having to be perfect, and more. In many ways, it's probably better to realize that the Asian American playbook only gives a contour and doesn't recognize a lot of the structural inhabitants or structural barriers that exist in a lot of these corporations, because the playbook talks about being an individual and how you could move up as an individual without recognizing systemic racism. Next, I want to talk a little bit about gender and women. So here's a double bind. So I want to highlight the intersection of gender and race, the double bind. What is surprising to many is that landing coveted management positions in corporate America, Asian American women are the least likely of these four groups, Asian American men and women and white men and women, to be successful. In a 2020 Ascend report by Kim, G, and Peck, they found that the racial gap for Asian American women is still greater than the gender gap alone among these four different groups. So using the framework of intersectionality, many of the Asian American women I interviewed made it clear that their professional options were limited, not just by the bamboo ceiling, which Asian Americans face, or the glass ceiling, which limits the options of white women. They are more than doubly disadvantaged because of prejudice born from the intersection of race and gender. In this case, for Asian American women, such gender and race cannot be analyzed in isolation. The stereotypes that follow, along with being demure, acquiescent, compliant, and sometimes sexualized too, none of them are leadership qualities, at least what we are taught in the US, and not perceived as such. And as the quote by Ricky mentions, when you do speak up, you're seen as too aggressive. And this sets up a situation in which it's impossible to be right. So things that are assertive in a man are seen as aggressive in a woman, and more so for a female Asian American, who are often seen as what I would say hyper feminine. They are in a particularly difficult spot with respect to getting ahead. They are not seen as people who have the assertiveness and the leadership qualities. And when they do, they are often penalized because they are acting out of a role that people see as appropriate. Moreover, as my research found, men and women of all races often could not see past her own race and sex to come to her aid in times of sexual harassment. Now, this is also true for the motherhood penalty for all women, where she is seen, for all Asian American women, where she is seen as the primary caregiver for her children. For Asian American women in particular, we have a relatively new image of the tiger mom, the intense and demanding mother who is regarded as too strong and also too focused on her children. What kind of leader would that make her? First, like all mothers, she's a caregiver, but as an Asian American, she is seen as an overbearing caregiver who devotes exorbitant time and energy on her children. Moreover, she's unforgiving, strict, and demanding without regard to the social and emotional health of her children. This image of the aggressive, competitive tiger mom, which has its own dynamic, does not help Asian American women. And it leaks into the workplace when everyone wants to take time to chauffeur their children. She's actually penalized more for doing that. So Asian American women are a good example because she often can't do it right. not because of any flaw in her, but because of the gendered and racial biases we've all come to accept, and consequently, how evaluators perceive her. And finally, I want to talk about moving to the executive level, which is where most of my interviewees are at and where they're actually having trouble. So I look to interview those who've actually made it to the C-suite. So I want to emphasize at the C-suite or at the mid-level, moving to the C-suite is akin to giving them a key to the organization. As the quote in this slide by Sam says, you need to be trusted to be given the key to the organization. And with a key, you can keep the organization safe. And you have to know how to use that key to keep the organization safe. So of course, as my high level executives told me, at this high level, there are plenty of competent people to choose from. Remember all the young Asian American men and women who are extremely capable with skills. There are fewer whom executives feel they can trust. As we've seen many others who have written about Asian Americans moving up, it's important for a person seeking to be promoted to be seen as warm, collegial, curious, self-aware, collaborative, diligent, and perspective-taking, responsible, and to possess the social leadership and other abilities beyond being just smart and capable. And to move up, to be respected, to be credible, and to lead, a person must be able to demonstrate both expertise and warmth. However, to ascend to the executive level, warmth is by extension seen as an indicator that a person is trustworthy and a member of the in-group. So of the people I interviewed at the top, there were 7 who were within 1 or 2 levels from CEO. All of them mentioned trust, which led me to research the theories on trust. I thought it was some, corporate lingo or something, but then I realized it's actually very true. And I think it's not only true for all of my Asian Americans, but also Asians in the workplace, as well as all the people of color. Trust really matters. So one executive, Soyeon, let's say, spoke about how one needed to be comfortable speaking about oneself, especially your children, and to be forthright. Now she understands why sports, travel, and even the weather are great conversation starters. Much easier to continue the conversation as it's already started, and much easier to develop that trust over time. Trust among people begins on a personal level. People have to know a person well, especially when it comes to promoting someone into the inner circle of the leadership team. As the people I interviewed pointed out, finding commonality and making connections were crucial. A few of the people I interviewed added that to trust is to be honest and open, to be able to feel comfortable enough to disagree, to argue, and to respectfully come up with a common plan behind closed doors. Another person said that to be able to trust meant that an individual had to understand where others were coming from and have the ability to relate to them. One way to do this was to show that you and the other person were alike in many respects. Find something in common with the other person. And of course, a few of the people I interviewed raised the issue of authenticity. Although they wanted to fit into the corporate workplace, they also wanted to be authentic. They didn't want to code switch. They wanted to be transparent. They wanted to emphasize the way that their race makes them different than other people. They were also the same in some ways to people of other races and ethnicities who have experienced discrimination. Jack, a Japanese American finance executive from the Midwest who graduated from college in the late 1980s, said he believed that people had to be true to themselves. So as a visible Asian American, he explained, he needed to demonstrate his Asian Americanness. For example, when he started to work at a time when many of his coworkers knew little about Japanese food, he frequently took them to interesting Japanese restaurants. At his current job, when he and his colleagues traveled to Asia, he, quote unquote, showed them the best places around, even though most of the restaurants, he laughs, were new to him too, especially since he was American born. But he felt that he could at least be a partial cultural translator. This was a truthful representation of himself, and he believed that his openness and vulnerability allowed his colleagues to see him as he really was. Of course, he also picked some awful restaurants too, but his colleagues knew that, he didn't really know, but tried his best. Jack knew that his team members accepted his version of his Japanese American self. He made it clear that while he was thoroughly American, like the other team members, he could explore other cultures. He also made it clear that he would support others in the company if he saw discrimination. As a result of such actions, his fellow executives trusted him, and he in turn trusted them. For Asian Americans, authenticity is a critically important issue, just as it is for other racial groups. However, to be trustworthy, one has to also be seen as warm. One way to be seen as warm was to be personal, be caring, have empathy, and to be authentically Asian American, however one may choose to be. The executive team typically knows that Asian Americans bring to the workplace qualities that are good for the team. For example, good education, critical thinking skills, even STEM skills, and good work ethic. Some want Asian Americans to attract business from the Asian American community, but to be authentic is to not hide one's background. On the contrary, a person should make use of that background and help others understand it. In an ever more diverse business world, people with different backgrounds bring different ways of seeing the world, which in turn benefit the business. As Jack noted, he sees his background as an asset that can be used to achieve positive results. Jack believes that he brings a great deal to his employer. He has presence, confidence, and poise. He is unusual that he is actually one of only 2 people I interviewed whose father, like him, was an executive of a multinational corporation. However, his advice resonates with so many of my interviewees. Being authentic is also being trustworthy. It means that Asian Americans don't have to waste time and energy figuring out a way to present themselves at work that they think will be acceptable. As Jack said, he didn't need to hide behind that model minority. Authenticity means you can go to work and be yourself. Others can get to know you. If your own race and authenticity is hidden and only sameness is stressed to the executives, then why promote an Asian American or let an Asian American ascend to a C-suite? In other words, what does being an Asian American bring to the company? As America becomes increasingly diverse, it's progressively desirable to express one's authenticity around food, dress, and activities. An increasing number of groups have been doing this, and it has pushed the workplace relations forward. And it's difficult to work while hiding something about yourself. And of course, other people can sense you may be hiding something. And this impedes trust and the relationships one has with others at the workplace. My particular C-suite leaders describe their ability exceptionally well to be able to build trust and to create and maintain social relationships. As they made their way up the career ladder, they learned how to deal with coworkers, both those above and below them. As we have seen, trust didn't truly become important until the mid-career level. Now, as executives, and in analyzing their own work trajectories, these Asian American executives acknowledged that they had indeed created relationships and established trust with others, starting actually on their very first day on the job, and sometimes learned how to do this even before, actually in college or in school before. So is there any science behind this? So Amy Cuddy, who worked closely with Susan Fisk on the stereotype content model, wrote that when a person first meets another person to establish a business relationship, trustworthiness matters even more than skills and competence. If someone you're trying to work with doesn't trust you, you can't get far. But if you become trusted, your skills and intelligence become less of a threat and sometimes even an asset in the relationship. Cuddy's research underscores the importance of trust in executive offices. We notice a person's competence only after we have judged their trustworthiness. When it comes to hiring and promoting people, corporate executives have plenty of competent people to choose from. And so they only want those who are trustworthy. If a person is trustworthy, a friend and a component, that person may be really useful in an organization. If a person is not trustworthy and a foe, and if also competent, that person may be very dangerous. So the importance of trust. Yet while all of the executives I interviewed agreed that trust is important, aspiring Asian Americans are only now discovering how significant a role trust plays in such settings. Employees at this level initially didn't think that trust mattered at all when it came to getting a foot in the door. However, looking back, as I mentioned, these executives looking back and having them think about their own stories, it is clear that in their own ways, they were building trust throughout their careers, even if they weren't consciously aware of how important it was. For a number of my interviewees, affirmative action, diversity programs, formal programs in colleges, and a few in their workplaces helped them tremendously. Programs that my interviewees mentioned were SEO scholars, Posse, Prep for Prep, and executive training programs. They allowed them to emulate, to model, and to invest time in different areas, how to be authentic, being accepted for who they are, especially knowing from the get-go that these programs are good for them and they should not be ashamed of them. And these programs, the language used back when they described them is not language that we use now. They're not structural programs to prevent racism. They were just programs that addressed that significantly addressed how you could promote racial equality in the workplace. So people didn't think of it as structural programs when they described them to me. They were just programs for them to access when they could. So Asian Americans who have made it to executive offices say they are trusted despite the fact that there is racism against Asian American employees. And one image of Forever Foreign is especially noted because it connotes un-American or other and thus can't be trusted. So I think that's in the background of a lot of people, especially when there is economic recession, because Asian Americans are oftentimes seen as the competitor, or Asians in other Asian countries are oftentimes seen as competitors. And we in the US conflate those two, making the assumption that Asian Americans are actually foreign. So, and I think what we can see is that during this pandemic, this image is very much alive. This image of Forever Foreign is here, and in no time soon will this image go away. It's being used even more and more with a rise in xenophobia. We saw this during World War II with the internment of Japanese Americans, even though the US was fighting Japanese overseas. After 9/11, with the Patriot Act and the rise in hatred towards South Asian Americans and Indian, Pakistani, Sikh Americans, they were seen as terrorists, although they were all Americans living here. And many times they draped themselves in the American flag to prove that they were American. And now we see it against East Asians as carriers of COVID-19 and the rhetoric of the Kung flu and the China virus, that language we've heard, and it's still being used. So this image is of Asian Americans being used as a scapegoat. It casts us members of an outgroup. Oh, I want to add too, it casts Asian Americans as a scapegoat. And we see that with the rise in anti-Asian American hate crimes, with over 6,000 now reported this year. So it casts us as members of an outgroup, and it erases our humanity, like that of African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. So it will be more important to be authentic and to defend others who may also be labeled in an outgroup. Clearly, those who ascend to the top are all capable people, but one way of getting to the top is to have other people's backs, especially African Americans and Latinos, and to believe in others and to let others believe in you, and to know that when others can take a seat near you at the top, and to know when they can protect you and the organization, largely because they also trust that you will do the same for them. Thus, one way to build trust, of course, is to stand along with others, and in this moment, to challenge our institutions to do better. So I think I'm going to stop here, stop my share of the screen, and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Dr. Chin. Some of you have already started entering your questions into using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, please feel free to answer it there, and I'll just go through the questions that have already been asked. So the first question is from Jenny Wong Medina. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about the composition of groups and data. Given the high number of transnational students, workers, and families, who gets counted as Asian American? On one hand, there's a racial component insofar as anyone with Asian features, ethnicity in America is seen as Asian American. But on the other hand, many Asians residing in America don't necessarily see themselves as Asian American, especially if they don't hold citizenship, and sometimes even if they do.
Thank you. That's a great question. So when I did my interviewing, I specifically targeted people who were born here or who came here before the age of 13, just to be able to control for what the broadly defined second generation would say, mostly because I was trying to test what was being said in the immigration literature about Asian Americans. And what I ended up finding out is that the model minority, and at least the model minority and the forever foreign stereotypes, still exist for all Asian Americans. It's not, nobody's immune from it. So whether you may be transnational yourself, maybe you may not even consider yourself American because you're a recent immigrant, those stereotypes still happen to play out on you. Because when I started talking to them about the stories, it happens that some of them describe stories of when their parents first came here, or of others they know in their workplaces, and it affects them the same way it affects the broadly defined second generation. So while my study is particular to the broadly defined American citizens, I would say, those stereotypes actually affect all the others, as we can see from this current pandemic and other conditions in terms of how they may be given stereotype promise to be given entry-level jobs and opportunities that other minority groups may not have. I hope that answers your question. That doesn't say what's going to happen politically or how people might consider their identity in other areas outside of education or work.
Thank you. And if for anybody in the audience, if you have a follow-up question after Dr. Chin answers your question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A and I will ask it as well. So I have two questions here from Edgar Randolph. First, how can the hyperselectivity found by Lee and Zhu be understood as cultural capital? Indian Americans have a standard high level of cultural capital. Chinese Americans have diverse levels of cultural capital. And then a second question is, how conscious were your interviewees of code switching? Is code switching inherently inauthentic? How is code switching related to language?
Sure. So in terms of cultural capital, if I think for the highly educated groups, many of them know or understand, or actually any of the groups, whether they're educated or not, have an innate understanding of what it means to network and to use connections to help get jobs, or to use connections to get information. So I think even in a communist country, a lot of times learning and understanding how you can get information or get goods through the back door actually helps out a lot. So I think when I was speaking to a lot of them, it didn't matter so much whether their parents had high education or not. There was an innate understanding of that, but it's different in terms of their understanding of how you would attain an education or a degree. For the most part, a lot of them in their Asian countries, they understood getting a degree as being able to take a test and do well in it, right? So lots of times they didn't think about cultural capital per se and how to gain better education. But here in the US, they were a lot more fluid in thinking about that, a lot more fluid in thinking about how the American system had different ways of how you would be able to use your own social and capital and resources to be able to understand and build these things in their own neighborhoods and among their communities. So it was a little bit more sophisticated and a little more adjusted to Asian American or American, I say, not American standards, but being able to use American, what should I call this? American networks to do this. So sometimes it was not always through their own ethnic capital, but they were able to sometimes copy what other groups did too, to be able to attain either getting into schools or getting jobs. And so that I would say is a little bit different for their cultural resources or capital resources. Now, your second question, can you repeat the second question?
Sure. Hold on. How conscious were your interviewees of code switching? Is code switching inherently inauthentic? And how is it related to language?
Okay, so I have to say that a lot of my interviewees were not that conscious of code switching. Only some of them were, and when they said that they were, they basically said they just started talking like they were in, and this is particularly true for a lot of the elite school graduates. They started saying that they were talking as if they were a member, a member of their social clubs in school that were not predominantly Asian Americans. And they would go into a lingo in speaking in a way that they would not speak to their parents or family members sometimes, or even others who were Asian Americans, because the assumption was that people did not understand what they may be referring to in terms of food, dress, or even a cultural item, or even just a way you would assume people would even understand what this Asian American playbook was. So for some of them, they were very conscious. Now, in terms of authenticity, some of them would actually say that was them both ways. So I would say that some of them would say that it was authentic. It was authentic that they could be able to code switch. And it was something that they learned, but it was still part of them because they actually functioned in both worlds simultaneously and were able to access this. For a few others, they thought code switching was completely authentic. So I would have to say that there was no definitive answer among Asian Americans for what code switching was and whether it was authentic or not. In terms of language, some of them really wanted to get rid or saw people who wanted to get rid of their accents. So for a few of my interviewees, even though they've been here since they were 12, they felt that they had some kind of Asian ethnic accent, and they actually worked hard at trying to get rid of it. Although I just couldn't imagine that they really had one that was all that noticeable. They might have been, and many of my interviewees, in fact, all of them said that they were always asked or told that their English was so good or they spoke English so well. And I think a few of them thought that, felt that made them self-conscious, that their English may not actually have been all that well. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. This question is from Michelle Gordon. Thank you so much for sharing your insightful research that helps us interrogate the facets and implications of Asian American model minority tropes. I appreciate it very much your intersectional analysis of the double bind in which many Asian American women find themselves. I noticed, however, an apparent lack of intersectionality in the data from other studies you cite about who gets promotions and occupies executive positions. Some of those percentages acknowledged race or women in the data breakdowns, so that it seems difficult to discern the numbers or percentages of non-white women in those studies. What challenges do these non-intersectional data breakdowns pose for your research into Asian American women in these contexts, and how do you address those challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to say that because this field, there's actually not a whole lot. And so I actually hope the book that I wrote raises a lot of questions and that people actually go out and try to do research. In fact, after doing this research, I realized there was so much more I could have explored and actually go back and speak to my interviewers about that. I just didn't have time, and that it was more important to actually get the book out, get something out, and hope that other people will do the research. So in terms of women, I feel that I've only made a really broad brush. These are some of the things that the women just mentioned, and I could, and or somebody else could actually develop a whole study, both qualitative and quantitative, in looking at how Asian American women do. In fact, I think after there was only one woman when I interviewed them, and this is all before. All be done before the pandemic, while Trump was president, and before the huge Me Too movement, when I talked to women. So there was only one female who talked about being blackballed out of her industry because she was sexually harassed and not being able to confide in any woman of any color, not white women, not Black women. She was the only Asian American female, in fact, at her level. And nobody else would listen to her because the perpetrator was a white man. And she felt that others were protecting him because he had the power to promote them as well. So I think, and only after the Me Too movement, I got phone calls back for some of these women who basically said, you know, I was sexually harassed as well. And I think this is something that's really important to look at. And I think new researchers who are interested in this should definitely look at the role that Asian American women have played. Because since that time, especially in the tech field, it's been mostly Asian American women who have come out and spoke out about their harassment, sexual abuse in the tech fields. And I think they're probably in all the fields where Asian American women, their stereotype way back from the Page Act has been of a prostitute. So I believe that image and others have played a significant role in how she's treated in the workplace. And that includes, of course, you know, wages and everything else. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So the next question asks, would the playbook be considered a reflection of cultural values or more of the reflection of acculturation to adopt more Americanized values to succeed?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's I try to make it so that it's not cultural, because a lot of people, when they think about cultural values, think about Asian cultural values that they bring from their home country. And I actually believe it's actually something that's adapted from the American society. It's structural. So American society says for Asian Americans, for any student actually, to be able to get into some of these elite colleges, they not only have to do great in tests and GPAs, but they also have to succeed in sports, succeed in music, do all these other things that make for a well-rounded, holistic, that do look well in a holistic application process to college. And likewise, those things matter when you go into the work world. Oftentimes, when you go into the work world, it's not just your technical skills that are counted, but actually your verbal skills, because you're doing an in-person interview. And it's how comfortable you are in expressing yourself. So I think it's, I don't know so much of it's actually cultural, but it's definitely a structural, and as a result of the structural conditions in the US that Asian Americans do this. And that's why there exists an Asian American playbook.
Thank you for framing it that way. I just really, really like how you framed that. The next question is from Kyle Tanaka. Thank you for the talk. Could you say more about how gender roles intersect with leadership qualities in your considerations? I'm thinking here of the role of traditional conceptions of masculinity and perceptions of Asian American men as unmasculine, quiet, physically smaller, submissive. I'm also thinking of groups like ABCs of Attraction, which positions itself as a service to Asian American men attempting to compensate for their perceived lack of masculinity by reinforcing behaviors and viewpoints of toxic masculinity. These factors seem important to your discussion of trust, especially.
Mm-hmm. Sorry. But yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think when I was doing these interviews, very few of the men talked about masculinity and the view of Asian American men not seen as leadership qualities because maybe they're not as tall, or maybe they're seen as more effeminate, not feminine, but more effeminate, or not seen as masculine in a way that we think of in terms of leadership. So while they didn't talk about it, I thought about it. And I felt that maybe that wasn't what in their minds in terms of promotions, that wasn't what they were thinking about. Because as you can see, they all felt that they were extremely capable. They actually thought of themselves as leaders, and they actually thought of themselves as being included. So at least with this particular group of men who were at least mid-level, who were at this high level, it wasn't one of the reasons why they were left out. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking that maybe it was. I didn't raise it. Maybe I should have. And I think this is also a question that is ripe for research, because I think actually there is a possibility. Because when we think about who are the leaders that we actually have in the corporate world, what does it really mean? When we think about the Asian American men who have made it up there, there are more South Asians and Indians. And the ones who are East Asian, I don't actually know how, I don't know how tall they are or anything else, but they seem to exhibit quote unquote, qualities of masculinity like all the other men up there. So this is something that is ripe for research. They didn't mention it. I have a feeling maybe they were embarrassed because I was a female asking them. So that may be another question there in terms of, the subjectivity between a researcher and their respondent. I hope that answers your question, but I believe there's something there.
Thank you. So this question is from one of our fellows, Brittany Frederick. I love your analysis of trust in the workplace. It reminds me of how a Black woman's demeanor can be connected to her work performance. Do you find that aspiring to be trustworthy can be viewed as a form of assimilation, either in the workplace or elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some people, when they said trustworthy, do you mean you're just like, brown nosing all the time and just acting to be trustworthy? And the thing is, I'm trying not to say that. I'm trying to say that you have to work as a team member for them to be able to see you as a team member. You have to be able to say things that are against the team, in a closed room, because you're actually trying to protect the organization. You're trying to raise questions that are important for the corporation. And I think when people do that and you're able to speak your mind in these settings, whether you're female or male, no matter what race you are, it makes people feel that you are trustworthy because you're not thinking of just yourself. You're not thinking of promoting yourself only, but you're thinking about the organization in general. I hope I answered that question. I'm not sure did I miss anything there?
I don't think so, but Brittany, you can let me know if that's the case. Our time is quickly running out, but if you did have one more question, please feel free to enter it in the chat. So I guess this is a bit of a last call. I'm going to ask one question before I ask the question that's here. It kind of relates to our discussion a little bit before the talk began. This is, we were talking about sort of like the increased sort of attention on DEI work in corporate spaces in the wake of the events of the last year and a half, and thinking about sort of how they fell short. And one of the things that I could, that was very sort of meaningful to me as an undergraduate student in African American studies was reading about Black corporate executives and how there was almost like this fear of like not going down what was then the DEI track, or what we would call the DEI track today, because of the fear that it spent money as opposed to making money. And so people felt really compelled to do this, to be involved in this justice work, but then it ended up kind of being a dead end for them career-wise, because then they weren't considered for the C-suite because they had been spending the company's money as opposed to doing the things that were revenue generating. And I was thinking about like what that means today, and if there was any discussion of that with your respondents at all.
So No, because this was done before George Floyd, but since then, when I give this talk at corporations or talk similar to this at corporations, many people who work in DI actually feel like they're trying to earn money. They're trying to actually increase diversity at their workplace. And if they can't do that, they're at least trying to teach the corporation about ethnic or racial history in the US. So what I encourage them to do is, instead of just teaching people what it means to be racist, because it's really hard to retrain people that way, it's more important to understand our history in this country. And when people understand the history in our country, they can actually make changes and actually, generate more money. And I think a lot of DEI people, when after I speak to them that way, they begin to see that, oh yeah, it's not, so it means more to them in terms of maybe they're marketing people, they may not be able to hire, for whatever reasons, enough people of color into that, or enough women, but at least enough of them will understand Asian American history or African American history, Latin American history, to be able to make the ad that's more relevant to people out there that can generate money. So it's another way of looking at it, so that people feel that they're actually contributing in a certain way. Because I have to say that a lot of the DEI people feel frustrated because they actually want to see more actual people come in who are of different backgrounds.
Thank you. Okay, then. So another question came in. So I'm sorry that if this is a rough transition, but thank you very much for that response. Jenny Wong Medina has a follow-up to her original question. I wonder how continuous migration from Asia to the US further confirms the forever foreign stereotype. Two questions related to this. Were you able to ask your respondents how they transmit their experiences to their children, to the new second or third generation? Also, did any of your respondents speak of working with foreign nationals in their fields? I'm thinking especially of the tech and legal field.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in terms of new immigrants, so while there are new immigrants coming in, there are tons from after the 1965 Immigration Act, more and more people are actually of this US born and the broadly defined second generation. So if you are in a corporation right now, over 40% of the people, if you turn around and look around, so close to half of the people are actually this broadly defined second generation group. And that group is only going to increase because of that 1965 immigration law. All of those children are growing up. Even so, the American born, the average age is 19. They're all going to college and going into the work world at this very moment. Our immigration has actually slowed down a bit because of the pandemic and everything else. But the children here are growing up. So I don't foresee that the immigrant generation will actually be greater than that broadly defined second generation for at least the time being, the near time being. So that's not going to change. But that forever foreign stereotype might still be here. If we, the American born and the second gen and everybody else, don't begin studying it and how it affects people in everyday life. Now, the last question is, how is the third generation or the second generation raising their kids? So I think all of them, believe that I'm going to teach my kid a little differently. I'm going to teach them about racism in the workplace and growing up. And I'm going to teach them a little bit about our history and what's it been like. And to actually teach them that you don't have to follow that Asian American playbook. In fact, that Asian American playbook is what inhibits Asian Americans from moving up in the workplace or doing things that are even broader. So for them, I literally ask, how are you going to raise your kids? It's like, hey, I don't want to repeat this and I don't want to say it's taking so long. So I think we have to definitely broaden out in the way we're thinking and that Asian American playbook, they don't need to follow it. I'm going to love them no matter what they do. They don't have to get the perfect GPA. They don't have to get, the A. They don't have to go to Harvard. That's the main thing, is like they should be able to be free to do what they need to do.
Thank you. So our final question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, for those of us who are about to enter the job force, how can we as non-Asian Americans offer support and uplift the Asian American community within our entry-level roles to help break down these societal barriers that have been erected by the former current leadership in place in both the public and private sectors of business, government, and education? While supporting and creating opportunities seems easier to manage in higher level positions, how should we approach this in the early stages of our careers to be active contributors to this cause?
Yeah, great question. So I think for Asian Americans and all people of color, if you have the power to reinforce what other people are seeing. So a lot of the advice that they give for supporting women, if a woman makes a comment in a meeting, or a person of color makes a comment in a meeting and somebody else repeats it, you might say, thanks for expanding on the comment that so-and-so already made. So these are little things that you could do in everyday life. And what they call that is allyship in the DEI space. Or what I would rather say is you want to act in solidarity. You don't need to just act in allyship, but you should act in solidarity. Look out for these types of programs, share your knowledge. I think what's really important is peers become friends, with all of these folks and learn. And the thing is, it not only helps them, but it helps you too, because different people from different backgrounds share all different kinds of ideas, like when you have interdisciplinary, arity in academia, you have all these new ideas that flourish. So likewise in the work world, that's often true too. So that's the best thing you could do is share your knowledge, mentor other people below you, and promote the people around you who are, different. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Chin. I wish we could hear audible applause, but we really are grateful for such a wonderful talk. So we really thank you. I hope that you can come back next week. Next week, our speaker is Dr. Tamika Nunley from Oberlin College, and she's going to be talking about African American women's strategies for survival in the 19th century. So thank you again, and have a great week.